Mrs. Brooks, as of this morning, every controlling interest tied to your husband's name now belongs to you." The lawyer's voice was calm, almost routine, but the words carried the weight of something irreversible, something final, something Daniel Brooks would never see coming. And across the polished oak desk, Emily Carter didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't even blink. She simply nodded, as if this outcome had been inevitable all along. As if the ending had been written long before anyone else realized there was even a story unfolding. And somewhere thousands of miles away, Daniel was raising a glass of champagne on a private balcony overlooking the ocean, laughing a little too loudly, leaning a little too comfortably beside a woman who wasn't his wife, completely unaware that everything he believed he owned was already slipping quietly out of his hands. Because 3 weeks earlier, Emily had stood in the doorway of their home, watching him roll a suitcase across the marble floor, designer wheels gliding smoothly as if nothing in their life had ever been out of place. And when she asked softly, "Business trip?" Daniel didn't even hesitate, didn't even bother to meet her eyes, just adjusted his cufflinks and said, "Important meetings, I'll be gone for a few days." And that was the moment most people would have chosen to argue, to question, to demand the truth. But Emily didn't. She simply nodded. The same quiet nod she would later give the lawyer, because by then she already knew, not just about the trip, not just about the woman, but about the pattern, the shift, the slow unraveling that had started months ago when late-night calls became locked screens, when working late became routine, when the man who once built everything with her began acting like she had never been part of the foundation at all. And what Daniel never understood, what he never even considered, was that Emily had always been paying attention, not in a suspicious, emotional way, but in a precise, almost surgical way. The way someone does when they've spent years helping build something from nothing. Because before there were luxury cars and glass offices and tailored suits, there had been a cramped apartment, unpaid bills, and a woman who believed in a man enough to help him become everything he is now. Emily Carter had been there for every late-night strategy session, every risk, every deal that almost fell apart. And while Daniel became the face of success, Emily became the quiet force behind it, learning every structure, every account, every decision that made his company what it was. And somewhere along the way, Daniel started believing his own story, that he had done it alone, that he was untouchable, that the woman at home would always be there no matter what he did. So when he stepped into that car that morning, heading to an airport and then to a luxury resort where someone else was waiting for him, he thought he was leaving behind a life that would pause until he returned. He thought Emily would remain exactly where he left her, unchanged, unaware, dependent. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that Emily didn't close the door after him and cry. She didn't call a friend. She didn't even check his messages again. Instead, she walked slowly through the house, past the photos, past the symbols of a life they had built together, and sat down at the kitchen table with a kind of stillness that wasn't weakness. It was calculation, because the truth was Emily wasn't reacting to what Daniel had just done. She was responding to everything he had been doing for months. And in that quiet moment, with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the soft light coming through the window, Emily Carter made a decision that would change everything, not loudly, not emotionally, but precisely, legally, and permanently. And from that moment on, every move she made would be invisible to him until it was too late to undo anything at all. Emily did not move quickly, because she understood something most people never learn until it is too late, that speed creates mistakes. And mistakes give power back to the person who already believes they are in control. So instead, she moved carefully, deliberately, as if every step had already been rehearsed in her mind long before Daniel ever packed that suitcase. And the first thing she did was not dramatic at all. She opened her laptop at the same kitchen table and logged into accounts she had not touched in years, not because she was not allowed to, but because she had trusted him enough not to need to. And one by one the numbers appeared, clean, organized, and quietly revealing far more than Daniel would have ever expected her to notice. Transfers that were just small enough to avoid attention, new accounts that were not in her name, patterns that told a story he thought only he understood. And as she scrolled, there was no anger on her face, only focus, because this was no longer about betrayal. It was about structure, ownership, and control. And Emily had always been better at structure than Daniel ever realized, because while he chased visibility, she had mastered what happened behind the scenes. And within an hour she closed the laptop, not overwhelmed, not confused, but certain that Daniel had already made the mistake that would cost him everything. He had underestimated the one person who knew exactly how his world was built. And later that afternoon, Emily made her first call, not to a friend, not to family, but to a number she had not dialed in a long time, a law firm that had once helped them during the early days of the company when everything was fragile and uncertain. And when the receptionist answered, Emily spoke calmly, clearly, as if nothing unusual was happening, scheduling a consultation under her own name, not his, and that detail alone would have surprised Daniel if he had known, because for years everything had been done under his identity, his authority, his signature, but not this time. And when she arrived at the office the next morning, dressed simply, almost invisibly, she was not treated like someone stepping into something new. She was recognized, remembered as the woman who used to sit beside Daniel in those early meetings, the one who asked the questions that actually mattered. And within minutes of sitting down, Emily began outlining what she needed, not emotionally, not with accusations, but with precision, asking about ownership structures, marital asset protections, corporate control, and what legal pathways existed when one partner attempted to quietly shift assets without disclosure. And the attorney listened carefully, because this was not a typical situation. This was someone who already understood the game, asking how to win it cleanly. And when he asked, gently, "Are you certain you want to proceed this way?" Emily did not hesitate. She simply replied, "I am not here to react. I am here to finish what he started." And that was the moment everything shifted from possibility to strategy, because over the next several days, while Daniel continued posting photos from oceanfront restaurants and private excursions, smiling beside someone who believed she was stepping into a new life, Emily was reconstructing reality piece by piece, gathering documents, verifying timelines, identifying leverage points that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with legality. And perhaps the most dangerous part of it all was how normal she appeared. She answered Daniel's occasional messages with short, polite responses, never questioning, never confronting, even wishing him a productive trip. And that illusion of calm gave him exactly what he wanted: reassurance, the belief that nothing had changed, that he still controlled the narrative. But what Daniel did not understand was that Emily was not maintaining peace. She was buying time. And every hour that passed without suspicion gave her another advantage, another opportunity to move something into place that could not be undone. And by the end of the week, Emily Carter was no longer the woman he had left behind in that quiet house. She was the only person who fully understood how to take everything back without ever raising her voice, without ever stepping out of line, and without giving him even a single moment to stop what was already in motion. What Daniel never questioned was why everything still felt so normal, because to him silence meant safety, and Emily understood that better than anyone. So she gave him exactly what he needed: routine, calm responses, no resistance, no sudden changes, and that illusion allowed her to move deeper into the structure he thought only he controlled. Because by the third day after her meeting with the attorney, Emily was no longer just observing accounts. She was mapping influence, identifying which assets were directly tied to Daniel's name, and which ones were protected under joint ownership, and more importantly, which decisions required his presence, and which ones could legally proceed without him. And that distinction became the foundation of everything she would do next, because Daniel had built his empire quickly, confidently, but not always carefully, and in his rush to expand, he had left small openings, technicalities he believed were too minor to matter, signatures placed where they should not have been, shared authorities that were never revoked. And Emily had been there for all of it, quietly learning, quietly remembering, and now she was the only one who could see the full picture. And that afternoon she returned to the law office with a folder that was no longer thin, no longer uncertain, but complete, containing timelines, account records, and proof of movement that Daniel had assumed would remain invisible. And as she placed it on the table, the attorney looked at her differently this time, not as someone seeking help, but as someone presenting a case that was already halfway won. And Emily did not rush through explanations. She walked through each detail with clarity, showing how funds had been repositioned, how certain decisions had been made without proper disclosure, and how those actions opened a legal pathway that Daniel himself had unknowingly created. And when the attorney leaned back and said, "If we proceed correctly, this could shift everything," Emily simply responded, "That is the intention," because she was not interested in confrontation, she was interested in outcome. And while all of this was unfolding quietly in offices and documents, Daniel continued living inside a completely different reality, one where he believed the future was already secured, where the woman beside him saw him as powerful and untouchable, and each message he sent back home became shorter, more distant, not because he was hiding anymore, but because he no longer felt the need to. And that confidence, that carelessness, gave Emily something even more valuable than information. It gave her timing. Because she understood that the most effective moment to act was not when he was cautious, but when he was completely certain nothing could go wrong. And over the next 48 hours, Emily began initiating the steps that would lock everything into place. Authorizations that required dual acknowledgement were reviewed and prepared, corporate filings were drafted, and most importantly, a sequence was created, not just what would happen, but when it would happen, because order mattered. 1. Move triggering the next. Each one legally sound. Each one irreversible once completed. And during that same window, Emily made one final adjustment that would ensure Daniel remained unaware until the last possible second. She encouraged him, gently, subtly, to extend his trip, telling him he deserved the break, that everything at home was fine, that there was no need to rush back. And Daniel, hearing exactly what he wanted to hear, agreed without hesitation, adding a few more days to his stay, never realizing that those extra days were the very thing that would cost him everything he thought he had secured, because by the time he decided to return, the version of his life he left behind would no longer exist, and Emily Carter, still calm, still composed, was now standing at the edge of a transition that Daniel would not see until it was already complete. By the time the plan was no longer just an idea but a sequence ready to be executed, Emily understood that the difference between success and failure would come down to precision, not emotion, because everything she was about to set in motion depended on timing, signatures, and silence. And early the next morning she arrived at the law office again, not as someone seeking advice, but as someone finalizing a strategy that had already been carefully constructed, and this time the documents laid out in front of her were not exploratory. They were decisive, structured filings, ownership adjustments, and legal triggers designed to activate in a specific order, each one reinforcing the next. And as she reviewed them line by line, there was no hesitation in her expression, only confirmation, because every clause, every condition reflected something Daniel himself had allowed to exist, small oversights that now formed the foundation of her control. And when the attorney pointed to the first document and said, "Once this is submitted, there is no easy reversal," Emily responded quietly, "That is exactly why we are doing it this way." Because she was not interested in creating conflict, she was ensuring finality. And as the first signature was placed, nothing visible changed in the outside world. No alarms, no notifications, no immediate consequences, but beneath the surface, the structure Daniel believed he owned had just shifted slightly, subtly, and most importantly, legally. And over the next several hours, more steps followed. Approvals were filed, requests were processed, and a chain reaction began, each action unlocking the next phase. And all of it happened without requiring Daniel's presence, because he had already given that authority away long ago without realizing it. And while Emily moved through each step with calm precision, Daniel was still living inside the illusion of control, spending his extended vacation exactly the way he wanted, unaware that every additional hour he stayed away allowed the process to move further beyond his reach. And at one point that afternoon, he sent Emily a brief message, something casual, almost routine, asking if everything at home was fine, and Emily replied with the same steady tone she had maintained from the beginning, reassuring him that everything was under control, that there was nothing to worry about. And that single response did more than comfort him. It confirmed his assumption that nothing had changed, that he still held the upper hand, and that belief kept him exactly where Emily needed him, distant, relaxed, and completely unprepared. And as the final documents of the day were submitted, The attorney leaned forward slightly and said, "By tomorrow, the transition will begin to take effect." And Emily simply nodded, not with excitement, but with understanding, because she knew that what mattered was not the moment things changed on paper, but the moment Daniel realized he no longer had the power he believed was permanent. And that moment was approaching, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with quiet certainty. And as Emily stepped out of the office into the late afternoon light, the world around her looked exactly the same. People moving, traffic passing, nothing indicating that anything significant had happened. And yet everything had already begun to shift, because from this point forward, Daniel was no longer in control of the system he thought he had built. He was simply moving through the final hours of a version of his life that was already being rewritten without him. And Emily Carter, still composed, still silent, had just ensured that when the change finally reached him, there would be nothing he could do to stop it. The next morning did not arrive with drama or warning. It arrived quietly. Like every other day Daniel had lived through, believing everything was exactly where he left it. And that was precisely why it worked, because when change comes without noise, it is often too late to stop. And just after 9 o'clock, while Daniel was finishing breakfast on a sunlit terrace overlooking the ocean, his phone vibrated with a notification he almost ignored, assuming it was just another routine update. But when he glanced at the screen, something felt different, not alarming, not obvious, just unfamiliar enough to make him pause. A message from one of his financial institutions requesting confirmation of recent structural updates. And at first he frowned, not out of concern, but confusion, because he did not remember initiating anything. And when he opened the message fully, the language was formal, precise, referencing changes that had already been processed rather than requests awaiting approval. And that was the first moment something inside him shifted slightly. A small disruption in the certainty he had been carrying for weeks, and he quickly told himself it was nothing. A clerical update, something his team must have handled, because in his world, things moved constantly, adjustments happened all the time, and he had built a system that ran without needing his constant involvement. But what he did not realize was that this time, the system was no longer operating under his direction, and back home, Emily was already one step ahead of every reaction he was about to have, because she had anticipated this exact moment, the point where information would begin to reach him, not all at once, but in fragments, each one subtle enough to delay panic, but significant enough to create uncertainty. And that uncertainty was part of the design, because the longer Daniel remained unsure, the less effectively he could respond. And within the next hour, more notifications followed, confirmations of changes he did not authorize, acknowledgments of updates he did not initiate, and slowly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. And when he finally called his office, expecting a quick explanation, the response he received was not what he had anticipated, because instead of immediate clarity, there was hesitation, a pause on the other end of the line, followed by careful language that sounded unusually formal. And when he asked directly what was going on, the answer came in a tone that was respectful but distant, informing him that certain decisions had been processed through proper legal channels, and that documentation had already been verified. And that was the moment the illusion cracked, not shattered, but fractured just enough for reality to begin seeping through, because Daniel had always believed control meant visibility, that if something significant changed, he would know instantly, he would be at the center of it. But now he was hearing about decisions after they had already been completed, and more importantly, he was being told that those decisions were valid, enforceable, and already in effect. And for the first time since he left home, Daniel felt something unfamiliar, not fear exactly, but the absence of certainty, and that absence made everything else feel unstable, because the foundation he trusted was no longer responding the way it always had. And as he ended the call and looked back out at the ocean, the view had not changed, the sunlight was still bright, the atmosphere still calm, but something beneath it had shifted completely, because without realizing it, Daniel Brooks was no longer the one directing the outcome. He was reacting to a process that had already moved beyond his reach and thousands of miles away. Emily Carter sat quietly in a space that now belonged entirely to her strategy, reviewing confirmations, tracking progress, and ensuring that every step continued exactly as planned, not rushed, not forced. but unfolding with the same quiet precision that had brought her this far, because she understood something Daniel was only beginning to learn. That control is not about who speaks the loudest or moves the fastest. It is about who prepares when no one is paying attention, and by the time the truth becomes visible, the outcome has already been decided. Daniel tried to regain control the only way he knew how, by moving faster, by making calls, by demanding clarity from people who had always responded immediately. But what unsettled him most was not resistance. It was the absence of urgency on the other end, because every conversation he had that morning followed the same pattern: polite voices, measured responses, and an underlying tone that suggested something had already been settled without him. And as he dialed another number, this time a senior executive who had worked with him for years, he expected loyalty to override confusion, but instead he was met with careful language again, explanations that referenced updated authority structures and verified documentation, phrases that sounded distant, almost procedural, as if he was no longer the central figure in the conversation. And with each call, the pattern became clearer. This was not an isolated issue. This was coordinated, structured, and most importantly, legitimate. And that realization slowed him down more than anything else. Because if this had been an error, it could have been reversed. If it had been unauthorized, it could have been challenged. But everything he was hearing pointed to something far more difficult to fight. Something that had been done correctly, intentionally, and in a way that left no immediate weaknesses to exploit. And as he ended another call, Daniel finally did something he had not done in weeks. He opened his laptop and began reviewing documents himself, not delegating, not assuming, but looking directly at the details. And what he found was not chaos, not a hostile takeover, but a sequence of changes that aligned too perfectly to be accidental. Filings that referenced joint authority, approvals that matched signatures he recognized, and conditions that had been triggered based on actions he himself had taken months earlier. And slowly, the truth began to form in his mind, not fully, not clearly, but enough to create a single, unavoidable question: who had orchestrated this? And as that question settled, there was only one possible answer. One person who had both the access and the understanding to move through his world without being detected. One person who knew not just where everything was, but how it all connected. And for the first time, Daniel thought of Emily not as someone waiting at home, but as someone actively involved in what was happening. And that thought brought with it something he had not felt before. Not anger, not disbelief, but recognition, because deep down, he knew she had always been capable of more than he gave her credit for. He had just chosen to ignore it. And back home, Emily was continuing exactly as planned, reviewing each confirmation as it came through, checking that every step aligned with the timeline they had established. And when her attorney called to confirm that the latest filings had been accepted and processed without issue, Emily did not express relief. She simply acknowledged the update and moved to the next step, because for her, this was not about whether it would work. It was about ensuring nothing disrupted the sequence. And as the afternoon progressed, the gap between Daniel's understanding and reality continued to widen, because while he was still trying to piece together what had already happened, Emily was already preparing for what came next, and that difference in timing became the defining factor between them, because control was no longer about reacting to events. It was about staying ahead of them. And by the time Daniel finally stood up from his chair, no longer able to ignore the weight of what was unfolding, the situation had already moved beyond the point where urgency alone could fix it, because every system he tried to access, every authority he tried to assert, was now operating under a structure that did not prioritize him the way it once had. And somewhere in the middle of that realization, Daniel Brooks understood something he had never considered before, that the person he believed had no power might have been the only one who truly understood how power worked, and that understanding had already begun to change everything. Daniel did not wait any longer, because whatever confidence he had left was now replaced by a growing urgency he could not ignore, and within the hour he had already booked the earliest possible flight back, cutting his trip short without explanation, leaving behind the illusion of control he had been holding on to just hours before. And even as the car took him to the airport, his phone remained in his hand, moving constantly between calls, messages, and documents, searching for something that would make sense of what was happening, something that would restore the structure he believed he still had authority over. But every new piece of information only confirmed the same reality. The changes were not pending, they were complete, and by the time he boarded the plane, Daniel was no longer trying to understand if something had gone wrong. He was trying to understand how it had already gone so far without him knowing. And thousands of miles away, Emily had already anticipated this moment as well, because she knew that once the pattern became undeniable, Daniel would move quickly. He would try to return, to confront, to reclaim, and that was why the final phase of her plan was designed to be completed before he could even land. And as she sat across from her attorney one last time, the remaining documents were placed in front of her, not many, but significant. The final confirmations that would lock every previous action into a structure that could not be reversed without legal consequence. And as she reviewed them, her focus did not shift, her calm did not break, because for her, this was not the climax. This was simply the completion of something that had been set in motion long before Daniel ever realized it. And when she signed the final page, the attorney looked at her with a level of respect that had grown steadily over the past few days. Not because of what she had done, but because of how she had done it, with precision, patience, and absolute control. And as he said quietly, "At this point, everything is fully transferred and legally secured." Emily gave the same small nod she had given from the beginning, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to question. The outcome was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. And at that exact moment, somewhere above the clouds, Daniel sat in silence for the first time since everything began, no longer making calls, no longer searching for answers, because deep down, he already knew the truth he had been avoiding, that whatever Emily had done, it was not impulsive, it was not emotional, it was intentional, calculated, and most importantly, complete. And when his plane finally touched down and he stepped back into the city he believed he controlled, everything looked exactly the same. The same streets, the same buildings, the same office towers that once represented his success. But as he made his way directly to his headquarters, bypassing everything else, there was a subtle shift waiting for him that he would not fully understand until he walked through those doors. Because control does not disappear all at once. It reveals its absence in moments, small changes that cannot be undone. And as Daniel entered the building, the first thing he noticed was not resistance, but distance. The way people greeted him, the way conversations paused, the way attention shifted just slightly away from him instead of toward him. And it was in those small, almost unnoticeable details that the reality began to settle in. Because without a single confrontation, without a single raised voice, Emily Carter had already changed the balance of power, and Daniel Brooks, for the first time in years, was no longer the one everyone was waiting for. Daniel walked through the lobby with the same pace he had always carried, controlled, confident, expecting the environment to adjust around him the way it always had. But this time something was different in a way that could not be explained immediately, because no one stopped him, no one challenged him. And yet the energy had shifted just enough to make everything feel unfamiliar. And as he stepped into the elevator and watched the numbers rise, there was a quiet realization forming in the back of his mind that control was not something you noticed when you had it, but something you felt immediately when it was gone. And when the doors opened to the executive floor, the space looked exactly the same. The same glass walls, the same polished surfaces, but the reactions were no longer aligned with him. Conversations softened instead of stopping. Eye contact was brief instead of attentive. And as he moved toward his office, the door that had always been open was now closed, not locked, but closed in a way that suggested a boundary had been placed. And when he pushed it open, the first thing he saw was not change, but organization, documents neatly arranged, screens active. And for a brief second, he thought he had simply arrived earlier than expected, until he noticed the details that did not belong to him anymore. Updated files, new access prompts, subtle indicators that the system he once navigated without thought was now structured differently. And as he stepped further inside, one of his senior managers appeared at the doorway, not rushed, not nervous, but composed. And when Daniel asked directly what was happening, the answer came in the same measured tone he had been hearing all day, explaining that recent legal updates had reassigned certain authorities and that operational control was now aligned under the revised structure. And the words were clear. But what made them difficult to process was how final they sounded. because there was no suggestion of reversal. No indication that this was temporary, only confirmation that it had already been completed, and for the first time, Daniel did not respond immediately, because he was beginning to understand that this was not a situation he could correct with a single decision. This was a system that had already been redefined, and as he turned toward his desk, he noticed something else, a folder placed deliberately at the center. Not hidden, not dramatic, just waiting, and when he opened it, the contents were exactly what he needed to see and exactly what he had hoped would not exist: finalized documents, verified signatures, and clear legal language outlining the transfer of control. And there, among the pages, was Emily's name, not beside his, not beneath it, but standing independently, holding authority that did not require his approval anymore. And that was the moment everything aligned, not gradually, but all at once. Because every notification, every conversation, every subtle shift he had experienced since that morning now pointed to the same conclusion. Emily had not reacted to his actions, she had anticipated them, and more importantly, she had already completed what he was only beginning to understand. And as Daniel stood there, holding the proof of what had been done, the room felt quieter than it should have, not because anything was missing, but because something fundamental had changed. The center of control was no longer where it used to be, and across the city, Emily was not watching, not waiting for his reaction, because she did not need to. She already knew what he would find. She already knew the moment had arrived, and for her, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to secure, because everything that mattered had already been taken back, not through confrontation, not through force, but through a level of precision Daniel had never expected from the one person he believed would never challenge him. And now, standing in a space that no longer responded to him the way it once had, Daniel Brooks was finally seeing the full extent of what Emily Carter had done, not as a reaction, but as a complete and irreversible shift in power. Daniel remained standing in his office longer than he realized, the folder still open in his hands, as if reading the same lines again might somehow change their meaning. But the language did not shift, the structure did not bend, and the signatures remained exactly where they were, clear, valid, and enforceable. And for someone who had built his entire life on control, on knowing exactly where he stood in every situation, this was something entirely different, because there was no argument to be made against what had already been completed, no immediate action that could undo what had been executed with such precision. And slowly, the realization settled in deeper, not as a sudden shock, but as a steady understanding that everything he thought was secure had already been redefined without him. And when he finally placed the folder down, his first instinct was not anger, but calculation, trying to identify a path back, a way to challenge, to delay, to regain some portion of what had been lost. And that instinct led him exactly where Emily expected, back into the details, back into the structure, because Daniel knew that if there was a weakness, it would exist in the process, in the sequence, in something overlooked, and within minutes he was already on another call, this time with his own legal team, asking direct questions, pushing for answers. But even there, the responses followed the same pattern he had encountered all day: careful, precise, and most importantly, consistent with everything he had already seen, confirming that the filings were legitimate, that the authority used to execute them was valid, and that any attempt to reverse them would not be immediate or simple. And as the conversation continued, the tone shifted slightly, not confrontational, but firm, explaining that the situation was not one of error or misunderstanding, but one of legal execution based on existing agreements and permissions. And that was when Daniel understood the full extent of what Emily had done. She had not broken the system, she had used it exactly as it was designed, and that made it far more difficult to fight, because there was no clear violation, no obvious fault, only a sequence of decisions that had been allowed to exist long before this moment. And as the call ended, Daniel sat down slowly, not because he had run out of options, but because he was beginning to see how limited those options actually were. And across the city, Emily was stepping into a space she had not occupied in years, not physically, but in terms of authority, because the confirmations continued to arrive, each one reinforcing what had already been completed, each one removing another layer of connection to Daniel's previous control. And when she entered the building later that afternoon, The same building Daniel had just walked through with uncertainty. The difference was immediate, not in how the space looked, but in how it responded, because this time, the attention aligned with her. Not dramatically, not with celebration, but with recognition, the kind that comes when people understand exactly who now holds the authority they must follow, and Emily did not pause to acknowledge it. She moved forward with the same calm presence she had maintained from the beginning, because for her, this was not about stepping into power for the first time, it was about reclaiming something she had always been part of. And as she reached the executive floor and continued toward the office that had once been shared in everything but name, there was no hesitation in her movement, no uncertainty in her direction, because every step she took now was supported by a structure that had already been secured. And at that exact moment, in a different room within the same building, Daniel Brooks sat with the weight of a realization he could no longer avoid, that this was not a temporary shift, not a misunderstanding that could be corrected, but a complete and intentional transfer of control, one that had been carried out not with confrontation, but with a level of clarity and precision that left him with only one undeniable truth, that Emily Carter had not just responded to his actions, she had already finished the outcome before he even realized the situation had begun. By the time the day began to settle into evening, there was nothing left for Daniel to question, because every path he had followed, every call he had made, every document he had reviewed had led him to the same unchangeable conclusion, that the life he believed was firmly in his control had already moved on without him. And for the first time in years, he was no longer the one shaping outcomes. He was standing inside one that had been shaped for him. And as the city lights slowly came on, outside the glass walls of the building, Daniel remained still, not defeated, not broken, but fully aware that something fundamental had shifted in a way that could not be undone by effort alone. And somewhere else in that same building, Emily stood quietly in an office that no longer needed to share space with his name, looking out at the same skyline, but seeing it from a completely different place, not as someone who had gained something new, but as someone who had finally taken back what had always been hers. And there was no celebration in her expression, no need for recognition, because the outcome itself was enough, the quiet certainty that everything now rested where it should have been all along. And in that moment, the difference between them became clear in a way that did not require words, because Daniel had built his world on visibility, on being seen, on believing that power came from being at the center of everything, while Emily had built hers on understanding, on patience, on knowing that true control does not need attention to exist. It only needs time and precision to take form. And that was the lesson that remained long after everything else had settled. That power is not proven in the moments when everything goes your way, but in the moments when everything changes and you are the one who saw it coming first. And as Emily turned away from the window and walked forward without hesitation, there was nothing left behind her that needed to be reclaimed, because she had already completed what mattered, not with noise, not with conflict, but with a level of clarity that left no space for anything to return to what it once was. And in the quiet that followed, the story did not end with loss or victory alone, but with a simple truth that could not be ignored, that the person who is underestimated is often the one who understands the game the best, and by the time anyone else realizes it, the outcome has already been decided.